Medici Latin reporting today. There was a notice out of Fox News that the Ukraine will be present at the NATO summit occurring in Vilnius, Lithuania. This happens to be incredibly significant that the Ukrainian President Zelensky, has reportedly lamented that the alliance continues to keep his country from joining. The Black Sea is part of the North Atlantic as a geography lesson. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has obligations to those countries that border the North Atlantic. The Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea are part of the North Atlantic. That makes attendance at that event important for Prime Minister of England and for the United States President. Joe Biden is RSVP'd no. Reports of his workload being too high, and he has a dinner speech. Of course, this is part of a broader issue. Medici Latin can report that the issue in Russia happens to be that there's 7 or 8 oligarchs that collected loans for shares back under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, where they basically had a meeting and divided up state assets between them. Meanwhile, Russia has gone from like 10% of the global economy to 1.7% of the global economy, because that's, loans for shares isn't how free market capitalism works. And it's, limited the development of Russia and Russians. Meanwhile, this, issue with Ukraine is merely a ego invasion for Vladimir Putin to show that he's strong. And again, there's nothing strong about inviting a comparison between the Ukraine and Russia. The Ukraine is a poorer nation. Invading the Ukraine doesn't make Russians any richer. And again, those Russians, that are on the ground invading Ukraine aren't better off by invading the Ukraine. The Ukraine is a shepherd nation that is, borders on the North Atlantic. Of course, the Cold War is over. Ukraine has sovereignty. It's a separate nation. NATO nations can be diplomatic, but should be in attendance and should have a clear stance on the Ukraine. Again, we think that Russia's wrong, fundamentally wrong, for undermining the sovereignty of Ukrainians. There isn't a plan to economically develop Russians. The invasion of Ukraine is merely a diversion. Where Vladimir Putin is one of those oligarchs that accepted loans for shares and collected bank loans and issued himself shares in state republics, in state-owned businesses back in the 1990s, in a way of trying to look like a market economy without actually creating any marketplace. And again, that loans for shares program is top of the agenda for NATO nations. The collective defense of Russians is actually important because again, Russians are in the North Atlantic. Whether they're Karelins, like St. Petersburg, or if they're live in Moscow, like Muscovy, or if they're in the Caucasus, or all the way over in Yakut, in the eastern realm of Russia. They deserve to have be a part of the collective defense. Their country was robbed. It was a bank heist in the 1990s, that's a bank heist that NATO oversaw. We supposedly landed the plane. We didn't totally land the plane because all the state resources went to 7 or 8 guys, and that's not good enough for Gorbachev. That's not good enough for Vytautas the Great. Vytautas the Great was a traditional imperial leader of Eastern Europe that knew how to lead, knew how to develop his people, by attracting businesses. And again, like Russia's only been closed, embracing this 1917 version of the Russian language that has no tradition. It is not the ancient language of horse shepherds. It's a language of one political party that killed the second political party in 1917. Those were the Cossacks. There were 500,000 Cossacks that were killed in a genocide. That was the other political party in Russia. That political party was the landowning aristocracy that were entrepreneurs, that were merchants, that were incredibly undermanaged up to the end, but certainly an underreported genocide. And that's something that NATO nations need to look at Ukraine and look at the tradition of one political party in Russia killing off the second political party. Because again, that's what happened to the Cossacks in 1917. That was part of what V.I. Lenin steered Russia towards, which didn't bring Russia prosperity. And again, the Loans for Shares program traces back to a lack of cooperation after World War II between the United States and Russia, despite during the war we engaged in a lend-lease program where America leased American assets, including tanks, to the Russians to defeat the Nazis together. And again, that's the spirit of cooperation between the United States and Russia. Back-to-back World War champions. Like we've been on the right side, we've been on the same side. Any friction between us is and friction between our people is contrived. And there's this issue of how do we return state assets to a marketplace where people can access them. Where 7 or 8 individuals ended up owning all the state assets, which all, but the vast majority of state assets that are marketable were just handed out in the Loans for Shares program. Which, again, that isn't how the Marshall Plan worked. We did offer the Marshall Plan to Russia, and Joseph Stalin blinked, which is a bummer because we spent a lot of time fighting the Nazis together, of which the loans for the Lend-Lease program was hugely successful in putting American tanks in the hands of Russian soldiers. And again, NATO take notice. You have to wind the clock all the way back to 1917. There's one political party in this entity that Vladimir Putin calls Kievan Rus. That there isn't a second political party in Russia. Where he's claiming that he owns Ukraine. Ukraine's been a sovereign nation for decades, and they declared their independence. And again, the war doesn't do anything for Russia. There's not a gain for everyday Russians, and look for Russians to continue to resist this distraction when the real politic in Russia is having journalism attack the Loans for Shares program, something that hasn't been covered here in the West. Where we said, just handing state assets away was acceptable, and we don't need to find it acceptable. NATO can take a stance on it. Joe Biden should have showed up to the NATO meeting.